Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happen to into this Truth Bomb Riff. I am recording this on Monday, September 8th, 2025, and I'm joined by an incredible human being, a guy that I really depended on a lot during our making of the con, somebody I respect immensely. Welcome back to the Clean New Deal and Truth Bombs the Con, Walter Bergen.
Thank you, Patrick. It's good to see you again, and can't wait to chat with you.
Yeah, because you have no idea. I haven't set you up for this. I haven't told
No,
you.
not at all.
I haven't told you. So first of all, let me compliment you on the wonderful hat, and then let me
Thank you.
also follow up really quickly. It was really amazing because I know you're a big tennis aficionado.
Yes.
That we saw, some of the reaction, of course, from Trump at the U.S. Open yesterday. Do you mind combining your hat, tennis, and the U.S. Open and Trump?
Well, the first clue I had was to see those tens of thousands of people waiting to get in while the match was already underway, I guess because of security. And then, of course, the people that run the Open said they were told not to mention anything about crowd reaction, blah, blah, blah. So, anyhow, finally we got to the tennis match, which wasn't the greatest match in the world, but it was exciting. It was a good match.
Bottom line is, it was your world, and for people who don't know who you are, even though
Yeah.
some may remember our discussion a while back. You were an executive for IBM for a long time. You
Yeah.
became a investigator yourself. You came to me vis-a-vis one of the most prolific journalists in all of elite media, a gentleman by the name of William D. Cohen, who writes for the New
Mhm.
York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and so forth. And you had been engaged with Bill on several layers, and you had found out about me through the con. And then we started talking, and I started learning that you had a lot of information that I wanted to know and need. And so we
Yeah.
started to come together primarily because of your knowledge of the savings and loan crisis,
Right.
and then ultimately all things 2008. But more importantly, what we're going to discuss now, I want to just give you a quick opportunity to kind of introduce from where you're sitting how you would, I would say, introduce our relationship to the audience.
Well, we I think we met up here in Saratoga Springs, where I'm ensconced, and I we had a pretty interesting discussion. I got involved because I was forced to sell my house down near Sanibel Island in Florida at the wrong possible time, 2009. And it took me a bit of time and a lot of research, and I got books piled up all over the place. I think I have every book written on the subject of the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis. So I really got into it very heavily. And to the extent that you're right, I met with Bill Cohen. He seemed impressed with my knowledge and background, and one thing led to another, and then you and I got together, and then you put together this terrific film series, The Con. So I still think I have most of that information still in my head, but we'll see in a few minutes, depending on what you have in mind.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. That's all
Yeah,
very accurate. So let me ask you straightforward. Do you
sure.
remember specifically what aspect of our work in the con that you had been a part of and that you attended in person as we filmed in Manhattan? Can you kind of explain to the audience what you
Yeah.
remember?
Well, there were a couple of highlights. One of the biggest was Greg Zuckerman, who was, I think he's still with the Wall Street Journal, and wrote a book, The Greatest Trade Ever, which was the story of John Paulson and his hedge fund in New York, who cashed in to the tune of $20 billion by taking out uh, insurance policies on subprime mortgage securities that he did not own. Technically, that's not insurance. You're not allowed to take out insurance on somebody else's assets or somebody else's life. But the way Wall Street operated and the characters involved in that, where they basically deregulated the product that was used called credit default swaps, and it was pretty stunning. But Greg wrote a terrific book. I think it's the rival of The Big Short. As a matter of fact, it had more uh, involvement as far as uh, hedge funds cashing in on the misery of people who lost their homes and the Wall Street characters who created this mess, which has still not been fully explored. And uh, I'm still keeping myself up on it. I've done some more research as to what led into it, which started with the savings and loan scam, which was the uh, similar kind of a deal that happened in the 80s, which led directly into the 90s, where all of the phony securities, the subprime mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, and finally the credit default swap insurance policies that enabled a handful of pretty sharp guys on Wall Street to cash in. So I'm pretty well still versed in that world, and I'm open to anything you might have in mind.
So one thing I want to introduce also that you didn't mention, but I
Yeah.
appreciate because everything you did is perfect by way of what I wanted to talk to you about.
Okay.
But there was another person that we met with in Midtown Manhattan that you got to
Right.
sit in on an interview with, which is one of the most impactful and important, really, interviews slash testimonies that anybody's gathered on the entirety
Right.
of the whole story. Do you remember our conversation with Neil Barofsky? And if so,
Oh,
what do
of
you remember?
course. No, Neil Barofsky was terrific. He was one of the sharpest guys, a terrific attorney. And I remember him going into detail as to his conversations with Tim Geithner, who was Secretary of Treasury under Obama at the time, and how Geithner refused to account for the billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that were going out the door to the Wall Street firms. And he got into shouting matches with Geithner, and Geithner absolutely, even though he was the inspector general for the whole subprime mortgage crisis, Geithner really refused. They were just writing checks to Goldman and Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America. Lehman was already bankrupt, as was Bear Stearns, the major players. But it was frustrating for him as inspector general not to be able to get any kind of an accounting accountability. The money just went out the door, and he was frustrated. I think I don't know if he finally threw up his hands at the end, but no, it was really a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed it.
Well, I'll tell you one thing he did do is he wound up on what's his name, Alex Gibney and
Yes.
David Sirota's podcast with all the same people that we interviewed. I don't know if you ever happened to catch that, but
No,
that's a
I
whole nother
didn't.
story. Okay, well, I'll send it to you. It's called Meltdown, and you should see it. But everything you've said, and I'm so impressed,
Yeah,
Walter, because we haven't talked in a long time.
right.
You just laid out everything perfectly the way I was hoping you might. So let me start with a series of questions here to
Sure.
see how you respond. Okay. First and foremost, what have you been paying attention to, if anything, as it relates to Lisa Cook, the Fed board governor, and mortgage fraud?
Well, I had heard, by the way, that Pulte, who is in charge of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and I believe it's the same Pulte who was the builder. Uh, right. This guy, I think, is trying to ingratiate himself with Trump, so he's been pouring through mortgage applications on Cook and I think a few other people, even
Adam Schiff,
shipped in California, and there was one other, I think. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing because, you
Letitia
know,
James.
yes, exactly, exactly. All of Trump's so-called enemies, but I mean, it's a joke. They're trying. I think the essence of it was whether or not a certain property was her prime living quarters versus. I mean, it's really such a nit. It's not even worth talking about. If it's a civil matter, and who knows what it is, but that's about as far away from what happened in 2008 as anything you can imagine.
Well, okay, but you answered that absolutely
Yeah,
brilliantly. And as
yeah,
it turns out half of Trump's administration has done the same thing with
of course.
multi-purposing their their primary residence, as has it been revealed by none other than Mark Elias, that governor of Texas,
Right.
Greg Abbott, and his AG, Ken Paxton, are involved with the same thing. So set that aside for a moment.
Says
Okay. Except for the fact of the indictment, supposedly, of mortgage fraud. Okay. So let's just think for a second. Hold on a second about the
well,
mortgage fraud.
mortgage
Just
fraud, and that's okay. That's uh,
but that's what Trump said. Okay,
right,
so
right, right.
what do you know about Trump's mortgage fraud as it is by way of the 2024 civil settlement in New York City by way of Attorney General of the state of New York, Letitia James? What do you know about that settlement?
Uh, well, I assume you're talking about the 500 and some $1 million that has I don't know if it was a settlement. I think they just said it was too large a figure. And I don't know if that case has been fully settled or the court's going back to come up with
It
what
was fully settled. It was the decision had
well,
been
it's
made.
fully
The
yeah,
verdict was made, but the appellate court or the court of appeals just
right.
reversed it. But anyway, what do you know about the actual case itself?
Well, the only thing I know is she was charging him with lying on uh, income and various I'm trying to think back. That's not my true area of expertise.
He tripled the size of his penthouse is one of the indications.
Oh, right, right. You're
He
talking
also tripled the square footage price of what all of the
right,
different
and
So
and add
without so isn't
and
that
added
mortgage
and he added a floor to the building,
right? So isn't that mortgage fraud?
of course.
Okay, so
But
we both know Trump lies, denies, switches the blame,
right,
and implicates. Okay, so there's no
right,
one. Let's just set that
right.
aside for the moment.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just say I think I want to insert this question first. What do you remember, if anything, about Deutsche Bank's involvement with Donald Trump?
Well, it seemed that Deutsche Bank was the premier bank. I mean, that was his main bank. And Deutsche Bank, of course, employed, uh, I'll think of his name in a second. He employed the guy who basically sold credit default swaps, if you want to go back to and he sold them to everyone involved. The Ryan Gosling character in The Big Short. What was his name again? You might. I have it
I
someplace.
don't
I could
remember
look.
his real name at Deutsche Bank, but I do know that you're absolutely right. And I wasn't
Yeah,
thinking that's where you're going to go, but
Greg Lipman. Right. And he was right. I mean, he deduced the fact that all of these mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, I don't want to confuse the audience, but they were basically filled with mortgages that under no circumstance could the person whose these mortgages were foisted upon, including HELOCs, second mortgages, could possibly pay them. They had no, everything was 1% interest for the first 2 years and then jacked up to 12 to 15%. And these people entered into these mortgages basically fraudulently because the broker and the subprime originators, the various Countrywides and Ameriquest, they didn't care because they were selling to Wall Street and Wall Street was selling to investors. So it's not
all
even
right.
close to what's going on with
Well, wait, hold
Trump.
on a second. Hold on. It is
Yeah,
though, but because okay, but hold on a second there. You
yeah,
went on a deviation, but it's exactly relevant because Greg Lipman, it
right,
was played by Ryan Gosling in
right.
what movie was that in? Remind our viewers.
The Big Short.
Okay, and The Big Short depicted whose actual short was it? Do you remember the name of the guy who they depicted?
Well,
The
it was
hedge fund.
Eisner. Eisner was the name. The actor Steve Carell played the actor who had to be convinced that these insurance policies were legitimate. And Gosling had the best line of the movie, which was, he's getting frustrated. He can't convince him. He said, "Let me give you an example. I'm standing in front of a burning house and I'm trying to sell you fire insurance. You can't lose. The house is on fire. I'm selling you insurance. You can't." And obviously the Steve Carell character
Right. Well,
finally agreed.
who was on the other side? It was Christian Bale's character. Who was he representing? Do you remember?
well, Goldman Sachs.
No, he was representing Michael Burry.
Oh, right, right. Well, he was the real Michael. Yeah, right. Michael Burry, but he's the guy who really broke the code and realized that the subprime mortgage-backed securities were going to blow up, and if he could buy insurance on them, he was going to cash in. None of his own investors were thrilled with that. He said, "You're the only one in the world who knows that the whole mortgage market's going to collapse when nobody else is talking about it." This is like 05, 06, and then into
Okay,
oh
this
07
is
it
this
finally.
is going better than I even expected. Okay, so let's circle
Oh,
back to John Paulson. Tell us who John Paulson is.
John Paulson is he owned a small hedge fund in Manhattan, 12, 15 people, and he hired a classmate of his at Harvard Business School, Paolo Pellegrini. And he told Paolo that he was only hiring him as a favor because he would generally hire a new graduate of one of the major business schools. And here he was, a 50-year-old guy who was born in Italy, went to a very smart guy, but for whatever reason could not make it on Wall Street. And he was unemployed. He met with John, he called John Paulson. He said, I'll give you a trial of a couple of months to see if you can come up with something. Paolo Pellegrini is the guy who really delved into the subprime mortgage market, and he came to the same conclusion that Michael Burry did, that these things are going to collapse, and if you have some way to short that market, you're going to make an awful lot of money. And it was Paolo Pellegrini who basically convinced John Paulson to invest in these credit default swap insurance policies and wound up at the end of the day making $20 billion for this little tiny hedge fund in Manhattan. And I think
Okay,
Paulson's
$20 billion is that not the largest trade in the
it
history of
is the
Wall Street?
largest trade in history, and
By
that's
magnitudes, by magnitudes.
by Magna. He himself made 4 billion, and this his whole story is in Greg Zuckerman's book. Now, for some reason, the Greg Michael Lewis, who wrote The Big Short, didn't didn't acknowledge John Paulson, but John Paulson and Paolo Pellegrini was Paolo who actually broke the code. He did a regression analysis and realized that uh, housing was housing and mortgage sales were climbing at an exponential rate. And I have one interesting little thing I'll throw to you. I use in a talk I give an example of a gentleman in California, uh, Alberto Ramirez. He makes 14,000. He's making $14,000 a year picking strawberries in California, and a subprime mortgage broker said, "Listen, I can get you into a $720,000 house." Guy's making $14,000 a year, and he said, "How are you going to do that?" He said, 1% mortgage rate, interest rate for 2 years, 720,000, 1%. That's $600 a month is your mortgage payment. That's what you're paying in rent. So poor Alberto signs up for a $720,000 mortgage, and he says, "Oh, by the way, what's going to happen after 2 years?" He says, "Well, two things could happen, both good. Number one, you refinance for another 2 years, still pay 600, or sell the house. Houses are going up 10% a year. You can make yourself in 2 years $150,000." So Alberto signs up. Unfortunately, mortgage home prices started dropping, interest rates went up, and he had to default and lost his house. And that's one of my prime examples.
That's a wonderful, terrible story, Walter,
And
but
wonderful, terrible story.
incredibly on point. So let
Yeah.
me kind of do a regression analysis here, but
Yeah.
just with a very simple question. What did you and I discover when we went into the Midtown Manhattan offices to do our incredible interview that has not hit the airwaves because we never could do season two of the con?
Uh,
What did Greg Zuckerman tell us? Do you remember?
well, he was very articulate, very smart guy. I'm trying to pick out what you're driving at. You might have to give me
I'll give you a hint.
yeah, go ahead.
Was it random, like it was presented in the Big Short, that they just were looking at the data, or was there a little bit more to it by way of how they were packaging their securities?
Well, let me give you my quick take on the security itself. First of all, when the savings and loan scandal blew up the entire industry, okay, the savings and loan banks in the 80s were doing the vast majority of mortgage originations. And because the savings and loan banks were federally insured, they had to adhere to strict rules of creditworthiness. You know, had to have an income that could support the mortgage payment. You had to make it possibly up to a 20% down payment. When that whole thing collapsed at the end of the 80s, 89, there was no one left to originate mortgages. Who stepped in? These wholesale mortgage originators that were not banks. This was uh, AmeriQuest,
Countrywide, Nationwide,
Countrywide, First Century, and so on.
Greenpoint.
They and all they wanted to do was close the mortgage. As I said, all they needed was a signature and a heartbeat, and sometimes the heartbeat wasn't even critical. So in the 90s, anybody could get a mortgage because they were going to be sold. The subprime mortgage originator, the Countrywides, they were going to sell them to Wall Street. Wall Street was literally putting up the money. They financed the
Do you,
entire,
do you remember what those loans were called? They were called warehouse lines, were they not?
yeah, there was warehouse lines of credit. And Wall Street didn't care what they were buying because they were going to put them into pull 1,000 or 2,000 into a mortgage-backed security, and these would now go out as billion-dollar securities to their own clients, knowing then they knew these guys are pretty sure they knew what was in those more. They didn't care either because they were going to sell them to their clients under the basis that they were AAA rated. But they were going to be a point or two more in yield than U.S. Treasuries. So a bank in Iceland or Germany or wherever would say, wait a minute, I'm investing in AAA securities at a point or two greater than U.S. Treasuries. Why not? With no understanding or no education as to what was in those because Wall Street wasn't about to disclose them. And you could ask, well, how did they get rated AAA? Very simply, the three major credit rating agencies, Moody's, Standard and Poor, and Fitch. If you remember that one scene in The Big Short where the Carell character goes down to meet with the woman in one of the rating agencies and says, hey, listen, how do you rate these things AAA when we actually visited some of these places and we know what's in those mortgage-backed securities? They says, well, if we don't give them AAA, they'll walk down the block and get a AAA from our competitor. And plus the fact we're going to expect to get three times our normal fee. So the rating agencies, those three rating agencies were almost as culpable as the Wall Street banks themselves.
Do you know who? Well, let's just think
Yeah.
about one firm in particular as it relates to John Paulson. And I'm sure you're going to say it correctly, but because your mind's already there. But do you know who the firm was that was selling these around the world and to whom, for example?
Well,
I'll give you a
virtually
hint.
every,
I'll give you a hint.
yeah,
GS is the one I'm going for.
yeah, no, Goldman Sachs, but Goldman Sachs was in a funny position because they were selling them around the world, but they were also they wrote the credit default swaps to Michael Burry. I mean, remember that scene? So they're playing both ends of the And when Michael Burry suggested that, I hope you're going to be around to pay me off when these things collapse, and the people around the table, you're suggesting that Goldman Sachs isn't good for the money, and he said, well, let's just put it this way: I'd like to get some assurances. Well, anyhow, every one of them, the weird part about it, a lot of the Wall Street and every one of them participated. There were five major Wall Street firms: Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch. They all participated, and they were all putting together these billion-dollar mortgage-backed securities. And I don't want to confuse anybody with a collateralized debt obligation was the sort of the sister of the mortgage-backed securities, in that the bottom tranche, if you will, of the mortgage-backed securities, which were sort of double B rated, couldn't be sold to AAA. So they just accumulated a whole bunch of these bottom tranches of mortgage-backed securities and created another security called the collateralized debt obligation. And magically, the top 80% were rated AAA, even though they were the bottom B junk on the originating security. It was bizarre.
Yeah, by the way, just a quick sidebar.
Yeah.
When you talk about junk, is there something that comes to mind that is a really good descriptor of what that junk was?
Well, you're not friend of junk bonds and Michael Milken. No,
No, that's before, but
no.
it
The
definitely evident.
well,
It's called Ninja. What does that mean?
oh yeah. Well, no income, no assets, no job. But when I described Alberto Ramirez, he was not alone. And there were millions of people who were told that sold the same bill of goods. And I know there's been this thing, well, why would these people possibly enter into a situation where they were told, number one, I'm going to pay $600 a month so I can handle it for a year or two, and I'll either sell it or refinance. And a lot of people were just lied to, flat out lied to. Uh, like
Okay,
some of the
here's a
people.
quick sidebar that just popped in my head because I just want to
Yeah,
get your comment on it real quick. You might remember, of course, one of the most prolific early versions of all of the stuff that followed because it was really spot on. But as you may recall, the Inside Job with none other than crypto Matt Damon as the
right.
narrator of that monster
Charles Ferguson's.
Charles Ferguson documentary that won a 20
Academy.
was it 2009 or 2011 Academy Award, where he said, yeah, we haven't even gotten to the first step of this, and then whatever happened to Charles Ferguson. But because in that movie, the Inside Job. Do you remember who Charles Ferguson was ultimately putting the blame on? Just as a sidebar.
I saw that many, many years ago, and
I'll cut to the chase. He kind of, because he didn't have the answers because he was so early to the game, but he did a
right,
remarkable way of presenting what they were
right.
doing. But he blamed it on academia and liars, that people that were inside the mix that wouldn't tell the truth because they were paid by. He was kind of doing an early version of what we're talking about in
Yeah.
terms of the credit rating agencies. But that being said, okay, so let's back up to the original question before all
And
of
by
this
the
happened.
way, if you don't get to it, I'll remind you later. I have a kind of a new take on who's really to blame. But you go ahead and tell me what.
Well, I'm curious to see what you're saying now in 2025. But so I want to revert back to what
Yeah,
we heard directly from Greg Zuckerman, and the greatest trade ever made because of the $20 billion scenario with John Paulson.
right,
So when I asked you who are they selling it to, well, a specific answer I was looking for, even though you know this, but I'll just cut to the chase because for the audience's sake. It was, among others, the Arkansas Teachers Pension Union, as well as the
right,
Pipe Fitters and Plumbers of
right,
America, all of which who took a case to the Supreme Court suing Goldman Sachs two
right.
years ago, where the Supreme Court said it was an act of God. But what did you and I find out from Greg Zuckerman that Paolo Pellegrini and John Paulson were doing? Do you remember exactly what they were doing?
Yeah, I remember. I'm not sure how Greg described it, but I know exactly what they were. When Paolo finally deduced that mortgage originations were far outside the historical line on all of his charts. All of a sudden, mortgages had a, and they just went like this way. This thing is then when he delved into the mortgages themselves, there was a characters in between Wall Street and the Wall Street hired independent evaluators, if you will. And these are the guys. Wing Chow was in The Big Short, sitting in Vegas. In other words, these are the guys that were supposed to evaluate the reliability and the credibility of what was inside these mortgage-backed securities because the original application were put in a safe,
You're talking
and
about
these
CDO managers, but by the way,
CDO managers.
yeah, let me, but that's
Yeah.
not where I was going, but that's true,
Okay.
what you just said. But where I was going, and this is what Zuckerman told us, and I've got
Yeah.
it on camera, and you and I were sitting right there, and I remember
Right.
looking at you when you told us they handpicked the
Oh
worst
yeah.
of the worst. Say it
The
again.
words to
Okay.
the word. Absolutely.
In your own words.
And no, well, that's the point. If you're going to take out an insurance policy, you want to make sure that building's on fire and the flames are as high as can be. Absolutely, the worst of the worst. Whoops, I lost you.
They put the worst of the worst liars loans embedded
Right.
in the mortgage-backed securities they were selling to whom? The teachers pension union and so forth, that were in front of whom? Supreme
Yeah.
Court. What did the Supreme Court say? They said it was an act of God. What did I just say? Was it an act of God, or did
No,
they do
of
it?
course not.
Okay, so was that intent?
Of course, of
Was that
course. And
racketeering?
well, you could you the thing is so complicated because
It's not
you had
complicated. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering. The predicate acts, the
yeah,
predicate acts they were all involved with reaching the number. What we learned from
right,
Bill Black, which is control
right,
fraud, because they had to reach the number and they'd do anything. But Goldman and John Paulson, the hedge fund manager
right.
that did raise, I don't know however many millions for Trump's presidential campaign this last 2024 at
A
Mar-a-Lago,
lot.
who we all thought was going to be named Treasury Secretary at the time. Now, but
Right,
this is where I'm going with this incredible conversation. Okay, so what we just established was the most important, crucial part, that you and I both had a witness, firsthand account with the guy who
right,
wrote the book, The Greatest Trade Ever Made, was that they handpicked the freaking worst of the
right,
worst liars loans to go in the securities that they sold around the world, including Abacus. Now, that being equal, I told you, and I don't know if you remember this because we haven't talked a long time,
right.
but because of my work, because you remember I worked with Chris Wecker, the former director of
Yep,
investigations for
right.
the FBI, who had the nationwide mortgage
He
noose. I mean,
predicted it.
he predicted it. He had the whole thing dead to rights, and he got rug pulled by then Anthony Gonzalez at the.
Right,
He was the AG for Bush because of everything
right.
that we figured out there.
Yeah.
But that being said, let's see, where was I going? Oh yeah, because of him, I had another witness, whistleblower,
Mhm.
somebody that was based out of Seattle, that told me straight up that they had vectors in Jacksonville, Florida, and in
Mhm.
Seattle, Washington, getting two parts of the country. Because you remember in Seattle, they were working with what's the company that J.P. Morgan Chase bought? That was the huge bank out of Seattle. That was like one of the
Uh,
first ones. You remember the
was it a
biggest?
mortgage originator?
Yeah, but they were a
Yeah.
huge bank because they bought Long Beach Savings, and that which was
Uh, um,
the guys out of Seattle.
yes, 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 yes. Well, Long Beach,
Long Beach was
it was a
AmeriQuest.
saving. Yeah, it was the biggest failure of a
Long Beach,
savings bank in history.
right? But it was
Washington Mutual.
Washington Mutual. Okay, so that brings it back. Okay, so now let me. Okay, this is insane, right? So we got the vectors. So what you and I just established
Hmm.
was the Big Short from John Paulson, where they're handpicking with
Right,
Paolo Pellegrini the liars loans to blow up around the world that they
right,
got from the vectors that were through Washington Mutual and also down in Jacksonville, Florida. And I got this from the director of the FBI. And ultimately, what we ended up finding out was okay, let's see, how do I want to frame this last piece of the equation? Okay, so it's 2025 right now, right?
right.
So a couple of things have just happened that have been huge, huge and important news. Okay, did you happen to read the New York Times this morning?
Oh, I did.
Okay, what did you see on the front page of the New York Times that might be relevant to what we're talking about?
Well, the one thing I saw on the front page was let's see, there were. Are you talking about the electric battery plant in Georgia? No. There was another one about
JP Morgan Chase being involved with floating Epstein.
oh yeah. Well, now I mean it's just coming out now that they're going through his account. I think the estate just released a bunch of stuff on his bank connections and
Look, the whole
to the
article was
committee.
written, but the whole article was written by David Enrich. David Enrich, the guy who did
Yeah,
Towers of Secrecy. Towers of
right,
Secrecy is about Deutsche Bank.
right,
What's her name? Rachel Maddow a couple of years ago
right,
did a
right,
story on it because she was interested in Putin's relationship with with Trump, which was all part of it. But really, the book was about control fraud at Deutsche Bank. So
Right,
Letitia James, for example, when she got Trump this last year in 2024 for doing bank fraud, mortgage fraud, she said he got it on the bank. But what she didn't realize, because of what we know,
right,
Deutsche Bank was in on it. Would you
right.
say, okay, okay, there you go, there you go. So first and foremost, so that's first and foremost. Second of all, so J.P. Morgan Chase, front page New York Times today, all of the stuff with Epstein. Okay. By the way, recently it's been revealed, and I don't know if you've caught this, but a lot of people started asking more and more questions, as we're seeing from the New York Times today, about Jeffrey Epstein's relationships with the financial structure. Do you recall where Jeffrey Epstein went after his time at Dalton by chance?
He went to Bear Stearns, didn't he?
There you go. There you go. So he was working at Bear Stearns. He had
Right.
a hedge fund that he called Liquid Capital.
Hmm.
Can you tell our viewers what Bear Stearns was in the midst of?
Well, I know exactly what happened to Bear Stearns 6 months before Lehman Brothers went under. Their two
That's right.
big hedge funds, yeah, went
Yeah, and it was
under.
run by Kiafi and
Keanu, yeah, Tanner and Siafi.
right.
They had invested in these idiotic things themselves. That's the bizarre part. That uh, I, the one side of the bank that actually created these things, and another side of the bank, they were buying, they were getting high on their own supply in effect, because banks need to hold a bunch of AAA securities as reserves and so on, for.
So the bottom line is Kiafi and Tanner were running the subprime part of it, right?
Right, but they were also investing, and they had them when the music stopped. It was the mu that's why some of the guys like Michael Berry and Steve Carell and crew were concerned that the whole thing was going to blow up before they could cash in. And if it blew up before they could cash in, either number one, all of the company, these so-called insurance companies, which were the Wall Street firms, would go under, and they'd have no way to pay these guys off. So they had to get out. Their timing had to be exquisite, which it was. They got out basically in '07 and early '08, and then they had their cash.
Do you
Now the
remember?
thing
Do
is
you
just,
remember? Do you remember what happened in the aftermath of Bear Stearns collapsing? What happened with J.P. Morgan Chase, as you recall?
well, they got a good deal to take over Bear Stearns. I think the government basically gave them the money to save Bear Stearns, not knowing
Do you remember what the name of it was? What the
what the process was that they.
it was called Maiden Lane.
Yeah, okay. Well, there were several Maiden Lane. Well, that was you're right. That's those Maiden Lane is the street down in Lower Manhattan, of course. I don't know if
Right,
you
of
knew
course.
that.
So,
Yeah.
well, are you kidding? I was at Occupy Wall Street, which was across the
Right,
street at
right,
Liberty Street.
right,
Yeah, so I was.
right.
Yes, I know exactly where that is. So that being said, Walter,
Yeah.
let's remember. Let's keep the breadcrumbs on the trail,
Right,
because we
right,
both know this stuff in and out. But this is what's happening now. It's 2025, Walter.
right,
It's not 2009. It's not 2012. It's not
right,
2016. It's not 2020. It's 2025.
right,
Okay. So what just came? We came to learn. Well, we came to learn that Maiden Lane backdoored the government bailout through J.P. Morgan Chase
right.
into none other than Liquid Capital. Who did
Okay.
the New York Times say on the front page of the New York Times? What was
Oh,
J.P. Morgan Chase involved with? High asset management of all things Epstein. Okay. Now,
okay.
by the way, Epstein, the article says that Epstein and company took off to Deutsche Bank, interestingly enough, after some things that went down. And I highly recommend you reread the article if you haven't.
I
But
will. I
but
will.
this is the point that I'm trying to get to. Okay. Okay. Now you've said all the right stuff. All the right stuff, Walter. So again, if John Paulson and Paolo Pellegrini
Right,
had intentionally blew up the world by planting subprime mortgages in teachers' pensions and yet YZ, and they walk with $20 billion, right? That the Supreme Court covers up downstream, and that John Paulson is now, get a load of this, get a load of this.
hmm.
As of did you happen to see the Epstein survivors on the steps of the
Oh yeah,
Capitol last
yeah,
week?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did you hear what their attorney Edwards said during the conversation with the media?
Well, I heard the whole thing. I'm not sure exactly. He said a lot of things that
What did he
uh
say after that? These people couldn't name names. meaning the women that were girls at the time. Why can't they name names?
Well, I could assume that they would be sued if they couldn't prove their allegations, and they took a big chance. Just
So who do they settle with in 2023? Do you know? Do you know who the Epstein victims settled with in 2023?
no, I do not.
J.P. Morgan Chase.
Okay, all right.
Okay, just so you know. And
Because
so,
that was their lead bank. I think wasn't other than Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan. I think
yeah,
that still has
but
not been
but
resolved.
but but but
Yeah.
Epstein was involved with Les Wexner,
Yes.
who's a billionaire. He's involved with
Right.
Leon Black, who's a billionaire, and there's other things with
Right.
that. But liquid capital is where I want to stay focused on
Okay.
because the nature of the bailouts, the girls can't talk. And so this guy Edwards says, "Hey, you're looking in the wrong place, media. You got to look into the FBI, you got to look into the SEC, and you got to look into the FinCEN files." Do you remember
Right.
what the FinCEN files told us a couple of years ago?
Which files?
FinCEN files.
No, I do not.
Okay,
That
so
I
this was a revelation by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, where they
ah
revealed that there was over 2 million suspicious activity reports that were reported from the people who were in charge of that at the too big to
mhm.
fail banks, but to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice did nothing. Okay,
Wow.
that's what
Okay.
this is all about. It was the dark money that came out of all of these bad actors laundered around the world
Mhm.
through vectors like Jeffrey Epstein and Liquid Capital into what?
Wow. Okay.
Into what? Subprime. And what happens after they blow up subprime? Now we know there was more money than just that. Trust me, there was
Oh yeah.
gazillions of money, but that was part of it. But guess who got bailed out at the end when all of the House of Cards fell?
Well, every one of the Wall Street banks got bailed out at the end.
Which also their clients, was it not? Was it not all the countries that
Um,
were? I mean, come
yeah,
on,
well,
that's what
yeah.
Fannie and Freddie did.
Well, the two biggest bailouts of all, AIG, which actually wrote the majority of the credit default swaps,
That's right.
even though individual Wall Street banks wrote them as well. And what was I going to say just then?
You're just thinking
Uh,
of TARP though, because it was much more than that. Because I've
oh
revealed to
yeah.
you that there was there
Oh,
was there was there
it
was there
was.
was 33 trillion in 2009. Then there
Oh
was
yeah.
16
No.
trillion in quantitative easing.
Yeah.
Then there was another
Yeah.
19
Uh,
trillion in the
yeah.
repo. Okay, so that went to the whole financial system. But who's ultimately getting bailed out, and who's guaranteed on all this stuff? Was it the American people who lost their homes? Did they get made whole, or was
No.
it
No.
the companies that were investing, or the
Yeah.
the hedge funds that were investing?
Invest is not even the right term because this was not an investment. It's as I said, once the S&Ls, which had to abide by very strict rules because they were insured, once they all went under, and I have a whole thing I can tell you
Go
on
ahead.
that.
Go ahead and tell me that now. Go ahead and tell me that, and then we'll close out after that. Go ahead.
Well, what happened, and I'll do it real quick. The whole thing quickly started at the end of uh, in the Carter administration. OPEC raises uh, uh, puts an embargo on oil. There's gas lines all over the country. Volcker takes interest rates at 21%. The savings and loan banks are collecting 6%, and they're paying out 15% for deposits. They they basically bribe the two congressmen, Garn and St. Germain, to totally deregulate the savings and loan banks. They deregulate them, and people like Keating are going out and building resorts and hotels and shopping centers and brothels with taxpayer money, and the whole thing blew up. And then in comes Countrywide, and there were no rules. You could get a mortgage with zero down, and you didn't even have to pay your mortgage payment. You put it on your balance. I mean, and that's the kind of crap that was inside these mortgage-backed securities. Wall Street knew it. They financed it because they knew they were going to sell it to their own clients. The thing was such a monstrous
Okay, so
scam.
you
It's
just said
unbelievable.
the same thing I did, but I want people to
Yeah,
understand this. Where were
yeah.
they getting the money from to support the warehouse lines?
Wall Street banks. They
And
they had deals with everyone.
international investors, including
Right,
Russia,
right.
including Saudi, including this, that, and the other, including everybody who was involved with Epstein, first and foremost.
Right.
What happened in the end when it all got decimated and blew up the world? We
Well,
gave them the money back, then
yeah,
some, and we kept doing it.
absolutely. You can make, governments can print money. They can just keep making enough money and they basically had to say, we can't let they had created this monster. The monster blew up everybody's. Now they had to put the monster back together because, we can't have the whole banking, the financial system. We'd have a worldwide depression and it would take, decades or centuries to get us out of it. So by this time, even though they caused it, they being the Wall Street banks, they had to be bailed out or else we wouldn't have a financial system.
Well, by the
And
way,
the
that's
first,
what the New York Times says today, that all of the senior executives on the high net worth asset, by the way, they provide much more information about Epstein bringing in the likes of Sergey Brin and $4 billion, and then this
uh,
another group out of
yeah,
Sweden. I mean, it was huge, right? But the long and the short of it is, okay, Donald Trump has been the kingpin of mortgage fraud for a very long time. His entire business is lying, denying, switch the blame, and implicate, on top of falsification of business records, of which he got nailed for 34 felony convictions. And there was
right,
a lot more that didn't come because the entire United States government failed to bring the cases that we're actually bringing you. That's
right,
first and foremost. So when he accuses Lisa Cook of mortgage fraud, understand that's beyond the pot calling the kettle black. You can't even say that's like, I don't know, comparing it to, a mountain to a molehill. Okay, whatever.
exactly. Yeah,
So that's first and foremost. Donald Trump was laundering money for Russia ever since the 80s. He was involved with the Russians. I don't know we know that there was a huge estate that he actually purchased out from underneath Epstein's, because Epstein was bidding on the same thing. This was next to
right.
Epstein's house down in
That's
Palm
the
Beach.
reason they had the falling out, I guess.
Supposedly, right, exactly. But that was a Russian who purchased that. The reason
Right.
that I'm making the point here is that the Russians actually bailed out Trump for years and years and years. And a lot of people think he's an asset. I kind of think he has to be. But the bottom line is, we just know that the money was flowing through Deutsche Bank into the coffers of Trump real
Mhm.
estate, but being sold through mortgage fraud to mortgage securities back to Deutsche Bank. Okay. And they were selling it to pensions around the world, first and
Right.
foremost. But then I just revealed to you, so those are two things that are happening right now. But the Federal Reserve governor, Lisa Cook, who is being
On the hot seat.
indicted for mortgage
Yeah.
fraud, the Fed board governors were the people that we know actually, through this guy Ned Gramlich, actually went to former
Yeah.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan with the evidence of everything we're talking about. And
Yeah.
it was up to the Federal Reserve to regulate the mortgage debacle that they didn't. That was this runaway train wreck that ended up blowing up the entire world. So it's kind of funny that the Federal Reserve is being looked at the moment as, oh, they're the good guys in this equation, even though we know Trump is trying to hijack the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve bailed out all of Wall Street during Obama and Eric Holder, first and foremost. You know it, I know it. Then moving forward with that, the next thing. So those are three of everything that's
Mhm.
happening right now. Then we're talking about Epstein, Epstein, Epstein. And like Matt Taibbi used to kind of mock, because I think he's compromised, Russia, 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 even though
Right.
Russia was all over the 2016, election
Right.
and so on and so forth. But, Matt Taibbi should know this stuff inside and out. But of course, Matt Taibbi was in Russia on heroin back in the 90s. And I think the Russians have got plenty on him, by the way. But all that being equal, the Russians were floating money through Deutsche Bank into Trump, yada, yada, yada. So that's all connected. But the most important thing that nobody understands that just came up on Friday as a result of what I just told you,
Mm.
that Edwards, the attorney for the
The girls.
Epstein victims, he says,
Right.
look into the FinCEN files, look into this and that. One thing leads to another. This guy, Thomas Massey, who is, I think,
Yes.
what is he, Kentucky?
Republican.
Yeah, and he co-signs this transparency Epstein legislation with Ro Khanna, and then of course none other than Marjorie Taylor Greene makes the epic what when she says we all have to come together to fight the elites. Okay, sure, and we got to name names. Well, she's not naming Trump, who's obviously up to his
Right.
eyeballs in this whole thing. But what happens as a result of all of that? None other than John Paulson. And
Yes.
as it turns out, John Paulson is actually working with Singer. I'm trying to think of Singer's first name, the hedge fund guy. Who's Singer's Paul Singer? Is it Paul Singer? Who's
I
like
think
the
you're right. Might
brutal
be.
hedge fund guy. Do you know
Yeah.
his story?
No.
Okay,
No, I haven't.
he's also involved. They're also involved with Adelson, Miriam Adelson. Okay,
Ah,
and they're pressuring Singer to keep his freaking, or not Singer. I just said it, Massey, to
Adelson.
keep it to Massey, Thomas
Oh,
Massey,
oh, oh,
to
oh,
keep his mouth shut, because as it turns out, Paulson is in
oh.
Epstein's black book.
Okay. Well, you know more about that than I do.
Okay, but is it all the same story? Just second verse, same as the first? I want to finish with the same. I want to finish
Okay.
with what you used to always tell me, which I thought was extremely important. You used to make the analogy to selling Rolexes, down there in Times
Yes.
Square. Tell
Right.
the story of how that works.
Well, I was always looking for analogies as to how this whole subprime thing happened. So I used an analogy in one of my talks where you could go to Times Square in New York and buy a Rolex watch for $20. And to the naked eye, it looks like a several $1,000 real Rolex watch. And if you put a bunch of them in a box and you tie a nice ribbon around them and you say these are genuine Rolexes, people don't look inside the box. They buy them as if these are the real thing. And of course, they stop ticking after 6 months, and you're stuck with a bunch of crap. And you paid the equivalent of what you would have paid had you bought the original Rolexes. I have one other analogy that's even better than that. There was a pharmacist in Kansas City several years ago who diluted chemotherapy medication. And once it's hermetically sealed, he diluted it with something up to 70, 80% saline solution, selling them to the doctors who were applying to cancer patients. Something like 2,500 cancer patients died because nobody could investigate what's inside that saline bag. And they attributed, he representing this is the genuine chemotherapy, 100%. It was 20%, 30%. Anyhow, that was my other analogy that I don't know if I mentioned to you.
No, that's a great analogy, but the one piece of the first analogy that you left off was they put those Rolexes, those fake Rolexes in the box, and they sold them to Bergdorf Goodman, who
Right,
sold them at top of the line. While
right.
of course Trump was, basically raping E. Jean Carroll in the dressing room. I'm kidding you. That
Right.
that part, that's a nice way
Okay.
to close it up. But is there anything else you want to add to this
No,
conversation, or anything?
the only other thing I would add, which we didn't mention, is that in two very large instances, there were deregulation laws. One was the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which enabled all of the major banks to get in on the scam, Citibank, Bank of America, and so on. The repeal of Glass-Steagall, which after the 29 crash, um, that law was passed that separated FDIC insured banks from investment banks. Well, uh, Robert Rubin, Alan Greenspan, Larry Summers conspired with Sandy Weill, former chairman of Citibank, to repeal Glass-Steagall. That enabled all the banks to get in on it. The second one was the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which deregulated credit default swaps, mortgage-backed securities. So there was no regulations. They had all been deregulated, and each of those characters got big jobs on Wall Street, including Phil Graham, who was known as Foreclosure Phil, and he went to I'm not sure where, I forget the bank he went to, but anyhow. So those two deregulation laws really enable all this to happen. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, don't forget Phil Graham's wife, Wendy Lee Graham, was on the
Oh,
board of
Wendy.
Enron. And so this led to Enron as well. But beyond
Yeah,
that, I mean, what you're talking about basically created a $4.5 trillion bubble in the housing
right,
market, made it a $900 trillion global calamity that when in the aftermath, we buried
right,
it. And then ultimately, we gave it 71 trillion over the course of the next 14 years and through three administrations, because what they've discovered was nobody's going to stop them.
right,
Nobody's gonna bring down the house on these guys.
right.
And you mentioned one other name that happened to be on the Epstein list there, or Epstein's black book. Do you know who that was, based on who you just mentioned?
Uh,
Larry Summers.
Ruben? Who?
Larry Summers.
Oh, Larry.
Larry
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Summers.
no, you're right. He
Yeah.
was.
So all of this is the same story. It's just morphs and morphs, and it's the
Yeah,
nuclear bomb of fraud. And what I'm telling you, my friends, is that you can discover the entirety of how this whole thing works in the blueprint that we've released for free, because all the American people buy our lies. You can discover that at
right.
thecon.tv. I've also got a group, because I still work with Bill Black and everybody else, called the New Untouchables. You can find that at thenewuntouchables.com. And we're involved with the Government Accountability Project and everything
Great.
within this administration at the moment. And then lastly, as my friend Walter's hat decrees, you can find the rest of all of the truth, what to do about it, and how we turn the tables on this monstrosity of fraud at thecleannewdeal.org. My
Terrific.
friend Walter, thank you very much. Least we not forget. Let's hit the last point over and over and over. Did John Paulson, by happenstance or coincidence or by intent, create The Big Short?
Well, once he understood what Paolo Pellegrini was explaining to him, he realized, oh my God, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to buy these insurance policies on the worst of the worst subprime mortgage backed securities, and
That they sold through Goldman to the whole world. And by the way, they handpicked the
yeah,
worst of the worst ninja loans. Are we
right.
on the same page there? Did we hear that?
Absolutely. No,
Did we know?
well, if you're gonna take insurance out on a burning house, you want to get the biggest and make sure that fire doesn't go out. You want to make sure that thing burns down, which it did, and his timing was impeccable. I don't know if I don't know that he knew that in 2008 he could have never pulled that off because it would have been too late. And because every Wall Street firm that wrote the stuff was now underwater. But
Wait a second. What did Greg Zuckerman tell us? What did Paolo and what was the metaphor that he used? Did they were they cautious in the way they approached this, or did they do something slightly different? There was an exact statement that he made.
You're right. I know the fact that Paolo was in cahoots with the CDO manager, that lady who she's trying to pick the best ones because she's supposed to represent the guy on the other side of the transaction, and she's going along with whatever Paolo, and he picked the worst of the worst. So
Greg Zuckerman said they backed up the Brinks truck.
yes, good. You had to have a fleet of Brinks trucks for 20 billion. It's the biggest transaction in Wall Street's history. Single
You'd have to have
transaction.
an aircraft carrier.
You're right. You're
You'd
right.
have to have an aircraft. They backed up an aircraft carrier. All right, listen, man. Walter, all the best to you and your
Okay.
family. I hope you're
You
well.
too.
Thank you for joining me. All the best, and we'll catch up soon, my man. Take care.
Great. Thank you.